The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi everyone, and thanks for joining us. I'm Gemma De Silva, part of the Enscape team, and today our webinar is on integrating visualization and design, focusing specifically on real-time rendering with Enscape. So we're going to start the presentation in just a moment, but before we do, let me just mention that we will have time for Q&A today. So if a question comes to mind as we're going through the presentation, please feel free to type it into the chat pane and we'll get to those later on. I also just wanted to call out 3 great places where you can find additional information on Enscape, and I'd recommend that you bookmark these so you can easily find them when you need them. So first up, we have a very comprehensive knowledge base where you can get step-by-step guidance on how to use literally every aspect of Enscape. You can search for topics here, find CAD-specific info, plus system requirements and getting started guides as well. We also have a YouTube channel that features lots of video tutorials from members of the Enscape team, plus our community of users. We also upload our webinar recordings there as well. So plenty of useful video content for you on YouTube as well. And last but not least, we have a brilliant blog where you can find lots of top tips, latest Enscape news, inspirational renders, plus some great insights from our customers as well. So I'd encourage you to check that out. All right, so today I'm joined by my colleague Petr Mitev, who is Enscape's head of AEC Technology, and Peter is going to be talking about how visualization has evolved and will also explain what's possible today thanks to real-time rendering tools like Enscape. So this webinar, I'd say, is ideal for those who are thinking about switching over to real-time rendering and those who are at the start of their Enscape journey and are interested in learning a little bit more about the tool and how it works. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Peter and we will get started. Thank you so much.
All right, let's get going. So let's start with a quick overview of what we want to get into. So the question is regarding integrating visualization directly with design. And you might kind of already be asking the question, well, isn't that what's happening currently? So we're going to answer that question first. And we're going to answer it by kind of looking at what the traditional AEC design process looks like, identifying some challenges and opportunities, and then kind of figure out how they impact the design and delivery of our work. And then we're going to end thinking about what opportunities we can leverage to improve our design process with this real-time technology, and what does it mean to our process? How does it make it better and different than what we were doing before? Okay, so introduction. Gemma gave a pretty great introduction. I just want to kind of give a quick addition about my background as well, if you're wondering where I come from. So I studied architecture for both undergrad and graduate, and even started working as an architect, which lasted very briefly before I started pivoting into technology with KT's research group. And very recently, I was the head of design computation at NBBJ before joining Enscape. So I'm kind of coming from the design background of things. Just kind of wanted to highlight that and reveal any biases that I might have ahead of this presentation, so you kind of know where I'm coming from. All right, now let's introduce Enscape. And I always like to throw this in because I thought that I was pretty familiar with it, and I've been learning a lot since I've joined. Which kind of leads me to believe that maybe everybody isn't as familiar as Enscape as I think they might be or hope they might be. But here's really what we're about. We empower and inspire the AEC community by helping architects and designers to understand their decisions, validate their questions, and communicate their ideas. And our mission is to deliver accessible, everyday tools to transform building design into immersive and engaging real-time experiences. And for me, that's quite powerful. But if I really look at what's at the core of this, for me, it comes down to this. It's the accessible everyday tools to transform building design. There's a clear purpose that's relevant to our industry, and by making them accessible, we really kind of ensure that they can have as much impact as possible. Because I think, as we all know, working in this industry, it's a very collaborative thing. You know, nobody designs and builds a building on their own for the most part. They're complex projects, and they require a lot of collaboration between a lot of specialists and a lot of different teams of people. All right, so let's get into the big question. Why do we visualize? And it might seem kind of obvious, and maybe it is, but it's to support design. I think for everybody watching, whether again wherever you might be in the big AEC or AECO chain, you're supporting some kind of design. You're not, you know, creating video games more than likely, or doing some kind of experimental art. You're making things for people. And when we kind of think about why do we want to go from image left to image right, that's the people, for me, are at the center of it, right? I mean, the buildings aren't just a piece of art or a piece of function. Even a parking lot is going to be experienced by people, maybe through the additional layer of vehicles, but nevertheless, it's a huge contributor to the environment around it, no matter how you cut it. And for me, that's a powerful thing. If you think about why you might want to support design in the workplace and think about the people, it comes to this. So I've got an interesting piece of information here from the EPA, which basically says that the average American spends 87% of their life indoors. And I know America isn't indicative of the world, absolutely not. But if we kind of imagine the global span of different lifestyles, cultures, this percentage is probably pretty close. Even if we give it a plus or minus margin of error or a 5 or even 10, it's still the vast majority of our lives that we spend indoors, inside buildings. And I think we don't need to look too much farther than where we are right now to kind of verify that, right? I mean, we work in a building, we live and sleep in a building. So if we can empower this design and delivery of these buildings, then that's a really massive opportunity to improve the environment we all share in the community around us, which I think is a great thing. So I hope nobody's thinking that, you know, visualizing to support design is diminutive in any way. For me, that's quite empowering, and it's a great responsibility that everybody in this industry has. And I also want to think about who is taking part of this workflow. Who do we need to leverage? Who do we need to be able to use these tools in order to create the most value? And I'm going to oversimplify here for a second, but let's imagine we've got pure designers on one side and pure computer graphics people on the other side, and kind of either side doesn't really know the other side's industry or processes, what have you. Now, those polar opposites probably don't really exist in most companies. We typically find ourselves somewhere in the middle of this gradient, right? You might be a designer or an engineer primarily, but yeah, you might also know a little bit of V-Ray or a little bit of Enscape, something like that. And it's important, though, to think about this wide variety of experience on design and CG, and to account for the fact that all of these people need to be able to access this technology. And when we, again, go back to the idea of accessibility, that's what we're talking about here. This is an incredibly diverse group of professionals that we need to be able to empower, because, again, the design and delivery of the built environment is very collaborative. No one individual or small team is going to do this alone. So we really need to make sure that we're creating some value for everybody that's a part of this process. So if those are the agents, what does the design process look like? I think it might want to be like this, or we might want it to be like this sometimes on long nights or tough deadlines. But the reality is that the design is really not a linear process. There's no straight shot from A to B. There are typically a number of forks and diversions along the route. And diversions might not be the right word, but maybe different threads. There's always a different process, a different workflow that we need to do in order to answer design questions. So visualization, I think, is a really great example of that as it currently stands. And I'll throw in energy modeling just as a little parallel here to give us some more context. But these are typically things that always need to happen to answer the questions, and yet they're always branching off from the main design thread in order to happen, right? Like we might outsource our visualization, we might have to engage some specialists for the building performance modeling, and there's nothing wrong with that, absolutely. But the problem kind of then reveals itself when we have to bring in that information back into this thread that we've already been carrying in the middle. And we'll talk about that in a second, but this is essentially what I'm trying to illustrate, is that the thread in the middle is going to continue. It might even stop, but this process, this way of working, really is isolating these different threads of questioning and answering. So this is one of the more popular threads, I think, or one of the more popular models that happens is that, okay, we need to create a visualization, so let's stop design. Let's stop design because we need to produce assets and we need to create content for a presentation or something like that. And right afterwards, we kind of have to roll everything back in and keep on going with the feedback. But it's not the only model I think that I've seen. There's also the fork model where we create the separate thread. They're happening in parallel. This is maybe more popular, I think, among the larger firms that can afford to have a dedicated visualization team, for example, in parallel to their designers and engineers. And yeah, they work in parallel. And then at one point, of course, they have to merge. And it's a difficult process because once we get to that point, these different models look very different. And the reason is they've been developed to answer very, very different questions. The specialized teams working in each are really not, or at least doing their best not to overlap each other's work. And that, of course, has implications for the merge that has to happen inevitably. So once that merge has to happen, we are faced with a little problem of value loss. And how can we quantify that value loss? I think the most direct way, if we're just talking numbers, is, well, the number of hours that it's going to take to merge this information, and of course the number of hours of missed decisions that you're going to forego when this process happens. I think inevitably, and most of us can probably relate to this, but when you're trying to bring two separate models to one point, there's always a loss of information, always a loss of fidelity. There's maybe little things like the way you move the light or a material selection on an asset, and they just get missed because there's really no perfect form of version control that lets us seamlessly mesh BIM data and or geometry data to kind of create a cohesive point of truth after they've both been developed individually. So we can kind of look at this as our opportunity cost, and like I said, it's still a numbers game, but we're talking about design here, and we kind of can't reduce everything to just that simple line item and a dollar or euro or an hour cost. I think we also have to consider the qualitative impact that it has on our process and on our work. So when we create the split, I think we're inherently committing to making decisions in a vacuum. In the split models, these decisions are really made in isolation. They're not at all informed by what's happening in the parallel model. Even if both models are being managed by the same team, there's kind of always this disconnect through the separation of information and medium. And because of these constraints, one model is pretty much almost always lagging in terms of development and eventually might even be abandoned altogether, only to be recreated for a later deliverable or a later presentation in the design stream. So we can kind of put some words to that visual example too, and let's go back to our visualization and design models. These are, I think, just some examples of questions that might be answered separately in these different models that then at the end we kind of have to merge together somehow and figure out, especially if the items are related, how we're going to blend them into a cohesive decision, especially if these have been presented separately, evaluated separately, and we now kind of need to create a documentation model, for example, or a documentation set. So this is where real-time rendering comes in. I think it really gives us an opportunity to not have to fork or stream off of the main design thread. I think it allows us to explore these different questions really in the same kind of design stream and do it as they need to be done, as they impact each other, kind of almost like a chain of development and adding more detail as we go along. So because real-time rendering is really, I mean, it is pulling directly from our design models, whether they're BIM or otherwise, we can kind of make a decision, assess, make a decision, assess, and continue that cycle without having to create these separate threads. So something like room sizing can immediately turn into a lighting analysis and then can immediately go back to a design exploration of something like a window location. And then with real-time rendering, we can, of course, gauge the impacts and start making other decisions such as materiality. So all of those different kinds of decision factors that we looked at in the fork model are now really happening in the same stream, and you're not burning time to create assets or to create separate information which might not really have a longer shelf life than your next deadline or your next presentation. It's really empowering your process to be focused on design and design development. And because of that, it also gives us the opportunity to kind of build one central point of intelligence. If we're always creating these separate study models, whether they're for visualization or building performance, it's really splitting our understanding of the project in different places. And with real-time rendering, we can really just continue building up that design model so that we're not really taking on the risk that something we've created is not relevant farther on. So one thing that really stands out to me when I think about the process is this idea of understanding the project and having a holistic picture, which we build up. The phrase from architecture school, which always stands out to me, is to look beyond the plan. And I don't know if any of you have heard that one, but I feel like it was really drilled to us in our heads in architecture school. And it's a little bit metaphorical, probably has a different meaning for everybody. But I think for me, the most important part of it was to know that we have to understand our designs from more than just one point of view. So whether that's a plan or a section cut, it doesn't matter, but it's not enough. You really need to have the most comprehensive, the fullest picture of your decisions that you can in order to make the best decisions. Because if you're excluding factors, if there are unknowns, that has a potential to be very, detrimental not only to your design, but it could even be detrimental to once you get on the field and start the construction process. I think we all know what change orders can do to a very good project, and it's in everybody's best interest to stay ahead of problems like that by knowing the full implications of what we do as early as design. And that admittedly puts a pretty heavy burden on the design team, but it's not a new one. And I think one we can lighten with modern tech. BIM is obviously one of the foundational pieces of software or technology which enables us to do that. Even in the earliest BIM tool, the designer was really easily able to move a piece of furniture or a wall and kind of see the implications across a ton of different perspectives, right? Whether it's a plan, a section, what have you. But it's really not the full picture. I think we all recognize that there are elements missing from just that. If we look at the image on the left to the right, for example, there's a level of detail that we're missing. And we as people need that layer of detail. I think if you're a practiced and trained designer, your brain can maybe fill in the gaps on the image to the left in pretty good detail. But most of our stakeholders in the process, our clients certainly, are usually not design professionals. So we need to do everything that we can to help them see what we see, and to also help us see the things that we think we see, but we don't. And having these kinds of comparisons like we have here right now, for me, is always just a reminder of how many things you can miss if you just stay in the image to the left, for example. Think about it, the view to the landscape. We don't get any of that. We don't get any of the planting. We don't know if that's an evergreen planting or whether it's a succulent or what have you, but there's just so much missing to tell the story of this space. And to be able to bring the reality that we need to understand how we're going to experience and engage with this thing. So it's an absolute necessity to be able to get there, both for designers and for our clients and other stakeholders. And I want to take a look at maybe even a more concrete example of this kind of decision-making chain. So let's take this example of changing the facade. We might change the shape and size of our windows and then quickly cycle through some positions specific to the project's location to understand how that might be impacting lighting levels or glare in the space. And in response to that, we might even change the floor or wall material to address that change in light levels, especially if we have glare or a low light situation, we might want to respond to that. And finally, we might even throw in some electrical lighting fixtures, which respond to both the lighting constraints and the newly changed aesthetic of the space. And it's interesting and also worth highlighting that in this thread, we're answering functional, aesthetic, and performative questions all in the same design stream, where we don't need to create these separate models. We don't need to branch off separate studies. This is all happening in response to one another, and it's happening in the main design and documentation model. And this type of chain is really not possible in that forked or split environment. These are discrete decisions, but they have to be made together in order to create a really informed decision. And I mean, just kind of, we can even pretty easily imagine that. Imagine if a daylight analysis didn't take into account the lighting fixture, not the lighting fixtures, but if it didn't take into account a drastic change in the portals, in the windows, that's obviously wouldn't make one or the other very informed, because they're not speaking to each other, and they're going to create worse decisions when we get down the chain to talk about something like materials or lighting fixtures, because we don't have the full picture when we make these decisions. And if we were to create that forked process, if we were to try to realize this chain of design in the forked process, I also think we'd be left with a ton of questions. So for example, where does the light location exist? They were probably modeled in the visualization model for the renderings, but how will they be documented in the design model? And what about the manufacturer data, for example? We probably showed the client a certain aesthetic, maybe from an asset or something like that, but now we have to translate that to documentation or render specs. And that's just one example of these types of things that we might have to do in that merge that we identified earlier. Or how about the decisions about floor or wall materiality? How are we going to ensure that they're going to reach our contract documents and specifications? And what's the relationship between our render materials and BIM data in the first place? Is there a relationship? We might have made changes to respond to glare or low light, but how are they going to be documented? And how are we going to ensure that that's actually going to reach the built environment? So overall, the traditional process just leaves us with a lot more questions and a lot more work to verify and understand after design exploration. It really doesn't empower design teams as much as it can because of the constraints of the workflow. It's really not a design workflow. It's a production workflow. And it's often thrown into design with limited benefits, but that's really because the goals are quite different between design and production. And we can kind of expect that it's not a natural fit. So here, let me just start this from the top. We've got a little video to illustrate the example, and I'm sure it's probably coming in a little bit choppy, but here we have a designer working in Enscape that just changed the solid wall to a curtain wall. They can instantly see the impacts on lighting levels, and they can even go into this analytical mode to drill in deep and really understand the lighting levels and if there's glare or any other kind of critical incidents. We can then change our flooring material to respond to what we saw in terms of the lighting conditions. And we can continue to explore these different elements as they relate to each other in different lighting conditions. We can change the time of day, we can look at it at night, and this is all happening in the same stream. When changes happen, they're instantly a part of the documentation or the central point of truth, because you're doing it all in one place, and you're continuing this kind of chain of questioning and answering. All right. And it's also worth highlighting that with real time, we're not losing any fidelity in terms of quality or production level quality. Even though we're really trying to focus on the design process, we don't have to give up any ground on quality or things that might be presentation ready or marketing ready. As technology in the space continues to improve, such as creating more graphics processing hardware and improving software efficiency to really take advantage of that hardware, real-time rendering is becoming more and more prevalent as a production tool as well as a design tool. And I already kind of revealed my biases. I'm from a design background, so I always appreciated pretty pictures, but to be honest, my primary goals were answering design questions. So it's always really inspiring for me when I jump on our forums or just dig around the internet and see what people are doing with Enscape and real-time rendering. And it always blows me away to the level of quality they're able to push it. And it's awesome because, we have something that's accessible and anybody can use, but it also has a fairly high ceiling if you're willing to invest some time and really kind of put some effort into creating some new assets and some more understanding of the underlying technology. You can create some beautiful images. And I just love seeing them time and time again from our community. It's so inspiring to see what they do. And this process kind of works naturally with your design exploration. When you start early on, we don't have all the pieces of the puzzle. We have to start abstract. But the great thing about this technology is that it can really follow your pace of design. You don't have to start with the utmost specificity in order to have something look good. I think we all know that there's a certain vagueness of design that we absolutely need in order to explore and iterate to make sure that we get to the best decisions. And this is something that can happen at our own pace. It doesn't have to be something that we schedule ahead of time and say, okay, well, at this deadline or at this presentation, we're going to send out for a rendering package. It's something that you can access at any time, and it can keep up with the pace that you want. And going back to this idea of production quality, it creates even more opportunity, I think, and value for firms that are willing to invest in it, because it can not only support your design process, but can also kind of support these other efforts that might add some more value for your clients or for your teams. And we can have confidence in the quality and the accuracy of these visuals. Just kind of looking at this image, for example, I mean, there are a lot of examples of the ray tracing or other bits of the technology which are really critical to making this an informed understanding of the design space. Looking at the chandelier, for example, those are pretty darn accurate reflections, and they really tell the story of how that material is going to interact with these different transparent and high reflective materials in the space. And that's something that you can have confidence in when making the decision, and when then being able to kind of take it to somebody and also get them excited about it, whether they're a potential client or whether they're a potential customer maybe that's going to be buying the space. And this is all in a workflow that, again, any design professional can engage. By centralizing intelligence in one design stream, we can ensure that it can be leveraged by all members of the team. And by eliminating the need for export and rework of the model, we can also reduce the need for specialists to make the process possible. Of course, we still want specialists on our teams to help shape and curate a culture of impactful visual representation, but the process really allows them to focus on questions of higher complexity and higher fidelity by empowering other members of the design team with the agency to render. And I think we've seen this time and time again with the kind of the empowering effects of technology. It starts out as something that is reserved for specialists, but with time, it becomes easier and easier for everybody to create value for themselves with that technology. And then it allows those specialists to kind of, once again, jump ahead of the curve and start working on the higher complexity questions, start figuring out, okay, well, what's the new technology that's going to take us collectively to the next level? And again, I think that's a really powerful thing of Enscape and others like it, that are able to distribute that agency, but they're also able to afford time and create value for pursuing even a higher level of fidelity and kind of pushing everybody forward. And going back to the point of accessibility, it's also worth noting that, you know, as a workflow, it can be very, very time and cost prohibitive, which has the power to impact accessibility very, very harshly. Many AEC practices are also not able to support the cost of staffing specialists in-house, and it's just a reality. So for them, these kinds of processes and technologies which enable and empower are not only an enticing value proposition, but a real need. And even for many of the larger firms, there are often projects which simply just don't have the timeline and the schedule to support a specialized visualization process. And in these instances, accessible and integrated become absolutely necessary characteristics of any process if it has any hopes to align itself with the design and delivery of their project. So pulling a little bit of information again, and I know it's coming from the United States, but we'll extrapolate globally. The average size of the firms in the AIA is 11. So the AIA is, yes, the American Institute of Architects, but I think it's really indicative of the scope of the industry. There's, you know, most firms aren't these powerhouses that can afford to hire a bunch of people, dedicate them to a certain task, and ensure that it's all going to work together and kind of come out on top. And it's also interesting that architecture firms with fewer than 9 employees account for 75% of all firms and 13% of all billings. And on the flip side of that, firms, the bigger firms with 50 or more employees have grown their market share to up to 56% of all billings. So what that tells me is that there's kind of a growing gap of accessibility in the industry. And if we continue to make tools just for one demographic, just for specialists, we run the risk of not being able to reach all these different designers and practitioners, which are smaller. And for me, that's really not a positive thing, because again, the built environment is a very collaborative thing. It takes people in every country and every kind of trade to improve it holistically, to make it better for everybody. So if we can create that value for everyone, then we can also create that opportunity to spend more time on design and to really answer the important questions that are going to take our projects and make them better for us, better for everybody as a community. So here is just that kind of statistic visualized in a table, a little bit more organized. They broke it down into 3 different categories, which I thought was kind of interesting to see how that curve progresses. And again, this is just for the AIA. It's not indicative of the world, but to be perfectly honest with you, I don't think that average would be very, very different if we were to go and look at the statistics globally, which of course, unfortunately, weren't available. But the average practice isn't huge, and that has a very, very specific implication on buying power, whether it's for software, hardware, or really anything. And it's one of the primary driving factors, I think, for market penetration when it comes to technology or useful tools, which our industry can take advantage of. So I think when we talk about visualization, of course, we always have to talk about the hot topic of cross-reality. It's been around for some time, but it also really hasn't been as widely proliferated, I think, as we maybe expected time ago. But nevertheless, it's a promising thing, and those barriers of hardware and software, I think, right now are probably the primary drivers of what's holding us back from widespread adoption. But we also have an opportunity here. If we reduce the time and cost of our visualization and design process with real-time rendering, we can also take advantage of other powerful representation techniques, whether they're VR, AR, mixed reality, or any combination of them, just as an example. Since we don't need a separate thread of work to create a VR-ready model, we can really easily afford to explore design decisions in VR a lot more often. And that gives us the opportunity to take it from a really kind of isolated and niche workflow to potentially a part of everyday design. And I think there's a lot of reasons why the technology is exciting, but for me, probably the most notable thing is the potential to strengthen our relationship with our teams and clients by making design communication accessible to everyone. VR really allows us to become immersed in a design space and just focus on that experience. And that's something that might be a native ability or knowledge to designers, architects, engineers, construction professionals. But for most of our community stakeholders and our clients, it's not an intuitive thing. It doesn't come out of the box. It's not how they spent their careers. It's not how they spent their lives. So we need to do everything that we can to make this relatable and understandable for them. There's kind of a cliche in English, seeing is believing, but being able to see a design in a way that's understandable and accessible is really the best way to get people to believe. And it's a powerful process, because by reaching and engaging more stakeholders in the conversation and bringing them into our vision, we really allow our project to be informed by a much more diverse set of voices and constraints. It becomes more informed and really a lot more mature. It's just a more complete culmination of the intelligence of the designer, the client, and really the community at large. It's a really powerful tool. I think, again, going back to that idea of accessibility, now we can extend accessibility to our partners, our clients, and really everybody that's a stakeholder on the project, which is a great thing. And I think VR and other cross-reality experiences also allow us to showcase and highlight other pieces of design intelligence as well. We can really build a comprehensive design narrative around this experience, where we don't have to just be limited to an exploration of aesthetic or constructability, for example. In addition to exploring the immersive space, we can layer on information such as analysis from the design directly onto the experience. For example, we could expose wall finish data while coordinating with our interiors team, or we could put on a spatial daylight autonomy grid when coordinating with our sustainability consultants. And perhaps we might even expose construction costs, allowing clients and team members to see the impact of their design decisions rather than relying on a super long feedback loop, which inevitably maybe leads to a value engineering exercise. And again, since this is pulling all from our central design model, there's really no shortage available of data or information that we can interrogate, which is informative to the diverse questions that we pose throughout the design process. And it really has the potential to extend the value of our real-time and cross-reality workflows by serving more purposes than just direct representation. It's really a central tool for crafting and presenting a design narrative, which again really pushes us to this more holistic and complete understanding of a design rather than just kind of one or two different perspectives. So here we have another video. So design review is a very, I think, central part to the design and delivery of any project. And whether it happens in VR or in a kind of mode, it's really the thing that brings our teams together and our clients together. It's how we communicate what we do. So in Enscape, for example, we're trying to think about that process as much as we can, and what else can we do to empower that collaboration? We've got the benefit of VR real time, but how can we bring people even closer? So this here, for example, is highlighting our collaboration function, where we can set tasks, comment on items, or really do whatever it takes to kind of document what we explore in our design review, so that we can really be sure these are things that are going to be make an impact in the model. Our designers are working in the same medium that they're reviewing, so there's no really risk of these things being missed or being misrepresented, because it's all happening in the same context. It's not, like a separate PDF sketch that somebody redlined and now you have to find, where in the building is the section. No, it's all very contextualized, and it allows the teams to come together in kind of a central platform, a shared environment, and translate feedback to design decisions. So as we look forward to the future of the technology and the workflows it enables, I think we can also look forward to the increasing accessibility to our industry as well. As hardware and software costs continue to decline, we can expect the process to reach more and more practitioners worldwide. And I think that's a great thing, because it means we can all share in the benefits of a more connected design process and the impacts it has on the built environment around us. We can also look forward to increased quality, really taking the guesswork out of design and allowing us to ask questions in early stages which would not have been previously possible until maybe even as late as post-construction. So overall, there's really a lot to be excited about in the real-time rendering space. The technology will continue to grow and empower designers and AEC practitioners globally, and the value proposition is strong. The workflow is a natural fit for the design process. And I'm sure with the creativity and ingenuity within our industry and our community, we can make it even stronger and even more impactful. So I just want to thank everybody for joining us here. And I think we are ready to take some questions now if anybody has them.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Peter. Great presentation. We have had a few questions come in, and if you haven't found the questions box yet, have a look on the right-hand side of your screen. There's a little chat box there, and that's where you can type in your questions for us today. All right, so first up, we have a question here. Do you think that it's fairly easy for firms to implement real-time rendering into their workflows, or does it take time and a lot of education to get everyone up to speed and comfortable in using the technology?
Yeah, great question. There are a lot of vendors out there for real-time rendering technology, and I think there's a lot of options for how you implement it. So Enscape for me is very accessible. So if you're talking about Enscape, I would say the barrier is very low. You can push out your first experience with really just one click and not a lot of configuration. And kind of like we were saying in the presentation, there's absolutely a lot of things you can customize to make it better, both in terms of material quality or creating your own assets. But just to get started, just to get up and running, it's really just one click. And there are, like I said, there's a lot of other real-time render providers out there, but for me, the barriers to adoption with those are really a lot higher. It does require a level of training and understanding before you jump in there, and requires a level of processing, I think, before your model is ready to look the best that it can, the best that you want it to. So yeah, I'd say with Enscape, barriers are quite low.
Brilliant, thank you. Another question coming here. Does Enscape use the graphics card to create renders?
Yes, Enscape is GPU based, and we've kind of had ray tracing from the start, but it is more effective specifically on NVIDIA GPUs, specifically the newer ones that have the RTX, the ray tracing capabilities. It'll work on any GPU, don't get me wrong, but if you're really trying to get the most that you can, the newer NVIDIA GPUs are absolutely perfect for the ray tracing in Enscape.
Great, thank you. Okay, this one is about SketchUp for modeling. So we use SketchUp for modeling. Would this apply, as I noticed your examples were using Revit? We currently use Podium, but feel it still has that element of cartoon-like rendering. Example being the flooring on your models have real depth.
Right.
So I think the question there is that is it possible to use SketchUp basically and integrate that with Enscape?
It is. Yes, it is. So I did. You're right. I did use Revit heavy-handed examples, and that's probably because of my bias that I revealed at the beginning. But no, it's absolutely possible with SketchUp. And what we did for SketchUp specifically is we added our own material editor, because Revit has a material editor, being a pretty comprehensive BIM tool, but it was kind of missing from the SketchUp environment. So we put it in with Enscape, but it's the same functionality as Revit, or at least 99% of the same functionality. So that flooring to that level of, like you mentioned, depth is absolutely possible. You can add bump maps, textures. There's a lot of other settings that you can customize in Enscape. And honestly, I would say that Enscape is, well, currently it's our second biggest community. So some of those images that I highlighted, those interiors as kind of really high fidelity examples, those are actually from SketchUp. Our interior community works really, really strongly in SketchUp, and yeah, I think it's indicative of the parallels and functionality between the two platforms as far as Enscape is concerned.
Great, thank you. Next question is about internet connection. Do you need an internet connection always for Enscape to work?
No, oh, absolutely not. I believe you might need an internet connection when you purchase it, obviously, to create the web transaction. But no, you don't need it to use it regularly. No. Now, one thing to note: if you are on a floating license plan, I would clarify what is necessary with your system administrator, obviously, depending on how they structure the consumption of your licenses. But no, it's not the kind of thing where you need to connect to Wi-Fi or internet. It's
Thank you very much. There's a few coming here now. It's getting a little bit tricky to see which one is next. Right. Let me see here. Where did it go? I had a good one then. Okay, this one. Do you have any tips for using Enscape at early design options, i.e. massing studies through design development, etc.? Because we're currently using Enscape as part of our delivery to architecture students in the UK.
Yeah. I mean I'd say yes. It depends a little bit on what platform they are doing their modeling in. So, I mean, again, from revealing my architect bias here, if you're telling me conceptual modeling, I'd personally do something in Rhino, maybe consider SketchUp. But what I mean is probably not Revit, for example. Maybe, but maybe not, depending on the use case. But I think in all platforms, it's quite possible. So, I mean, Enscape has a very easy kind of abstract mode or white mode that you can kind of apply to everything, and that'll really take the specificity out of it. Or of course you could always create your own material definition for an abstract material that doesn't have all that information of like a wood or a steel or something like that, and then apply it to your elements as needed. And I will mention that one of our more requested features has been this kind of diagrammatic rendering mode, something like a cartoon, not a cartoon, but like a comic style or an artistic style. So we hear you on that one, and we're definitely considering it. So more to follow up on that soon. But in the meantime, I think there's a good amount of options as well.
Great. A few questions are coming in about assets and whether we have a library of ready-made assets available.
We do. We have definitely a large library of assets. It's available to Enscape on all the platforms. Doesn't matter what your CAD plugin is. And I will mention that they are also very well optimized assets, meaning not just that they look great, but they also perform great. One thing that we heard a lot from our customers is that these kinds of assets have the potential to really slow down your model, even when you stop visualizing. So, as I'm talking about building up one point of intelligence, okay, that sounds great, but if we really weigh down that model with kind of trees or people or whatever, like we see in front of us, that's not really conducive to your design process. So our assets are all made from scratch, made in-house, and our teams are really constantly making sure that they are performant and correct in terms of aesthetics. So I would encourage everybody to check those out.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. And another, I think 1 or 2 questions. Can we expect to see more functionality added to Enscape this year?
Well, that functionality is so vague, but yes, absolutely. And I started there because for a second I thought we were in 2020 still, and I was like, oh, what if we have 2 days left? I can't commit to that. But no, there are releases planned for 2021. We're very excited about them, of course, and I think everybody will be excited as well. So functionality is going to continue coming 2021, 22, and for the foreseeable future.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. And then a question here about, is there any training available? Well, you can visit YouTube. We have a lot of great tutorials there. We also have our knowledge base where you can find articles on a range of topics, and we actually run webinars for each of the CADs as well. So if you take a look at our webinar page, and I'll chat to link out to that in a moment, then you can find upcoming training available there. But with that, I think that is all the questions. If I have missed a question, I'll have a look after the webinar and I'll make sure that I get back to you on email. But I think we'll leave it there. Thank you so much, Peter, for your time today and for presenting and answering the questions. And thanks to our audience as well. Thanks for joining us, taking time out of your day to learn a little bit more about real-time rendering in Enscape. Hope you enjoyed the session and got something out of it and are ready to even try out Enscape yourself if you're not already using it. So to wrap up, there will be a short survey that will pop up on your screen as you leave the webinar. So if you could fill that in and let us know what you thought of today's webinar, we'd really appreciate it. Your feedback is really important and it helps us to improve these sessions going forward. So if you could take a moment to fill that in, that would be great. You will also receive a copy of the recording via email in the next few hours. And we'll send you a few extra useful links as well. So keep an eye out for that. So with that, thank you very much for joining us. Enjoy the rest of your day, and I hope you can join us again for another webinar soon. Thanks very much, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you.